Chapter 2 Literature Review 2.1 Introduction. The adaptation process for a production is challenging. In function of this chapter will present a way forward through the analysis of the pertinent literature to address this challenge. The following research sources presented in the literature review will be continuously referred to in other sections to not only support certain arguments, but to also be used as a point of reference throughout the practical aspect of this dissertation. The following literature review is divided into 4 separate sections to help clarify the different aspects being analyzed throughout this dissertation. These aspects are based on the researcher's necessity to understand and strategize the process in adapting a horror film into a comedic theatre production. As a result, the sections of the literature review are dedicated to exploring the horror and comedy genre, the film and theatre medium, style, and narrative. 2.2 Genres. Horror. The horror and comedy genres each have an abundant number of subgenres, most of which can be incorporated into any medium. In the Columbia University paper, Horror Theatre Investing in the Aesthetics of Horror as a Theatrical Genre, Richardson explores ways in which the horror genre can be used as a platform to reveal what is relevant to the common person despite the extraordinary elements that the horror genre is presented with. Richardson also investigates what possible vital parts make up or is incorporated in a person's identity, showing the importance of gore and how it is perceived, and to what extent the female can be liberated through horror. It is stated that gore, particularly when it involves blood being outside the body, is often effective in horror because it relates to the audience member's personal experiences of physical suffering. Richardson's dissertation also consists of multiple references to feminist works, such as those by Carol Clover and Cynthia A. Freeland, who coined the term final girl, the female character who temporarily or permanently defeats the killer in a slasher film and is then seen as the hero with feminine and masculine qualities. The final girl has also been used as a method in horror to encourage the male audience to identify with and be in favor of the typically sexually transgressive female lead, despite initially identifying with the male killer and later cheering when he is defeated. Comedy. The main focus of this section is the interface between comedy and horror. However, it should be stated that the comedy genre has a long history that consists of the development and use of its various subgenres, including anarchic comedy, slapstick, parody, and black comedy. Although gore is typically associated with the horror genre, comedy can also be conveyed through gore, such as through horror comedy. Palmer demonstrates in Herschel Gordon Lewis' Godfather of Gore a plethora of ways in which the black comedy, otherwise referred to as black humor, can be positively perceived when incorporated into the horror genre, as can be seen from the numerous examples given in his book. One of these includes the B-movie to stage musical adaptation The Little Shop of Horrors, a story about an alien plant that feeds on human blood in order to grow. The black comedy works well in this structure because of the audience's disbelief in realizing that the traditional monster that typically appears in the horror genre is none other than a supposedly common everyday indoor plant, as opposed to something that is traditionally unnatural and menacing. Further theatre productions are explored in Una Therese-Walsh's thesis paper, The Role of Black Humor in the Plays of George F. Walker, which explores pieces that are also associated with the theatre of the absurd and parody. A few common tropes that feature in theatre parody productions, one such being Beyond Mozambique, are the use of low-budget adaptations to contrast the grandeur associated with its original source and exaggerate its character types. One such example being the choice made in setting the play in a tropical jungle in Mozambique, only for the set design to be very minimal and completely against the audience's expectations. Absurdist dramatists, such as Samuel Beckett and Eugenio Nesco, have their own ways of approaching the absurd through theatre, for instance, by presenting absurdity to the audience rather than discussing it. Similarly in horror, One of the effects in absurdism is to discomfort audience members. The comedy genre gives artists a platform to experiment with certain tropes to present an original concept or structure. It is because of this flexibility that horror and comedy are capable of working very effectively together, depending on which comedy tropes are being manipulated to achieve this. 2.3 Medium. Film. Film and theatre incorporate a multitude of semiotics, and it is necessary to analyze what these are and how they should be perceived from both perspectives to determine what should be incorporated or further developed during the film-to-stage adaptation process. Sipos' book, Horror Film Aesthetics: Creating the Visual Language of Fear, analyzes the different attributes of a horror film and how its cinematic elements are dealt with during the filmmaking process. During different stages of filming, a lot of importance is drawn towards the visual components, such as the lighting, framing, and photography. This makes sense given that film is typically a visual medium, although horror films such as the original Suspiria enhance their tone and atmosphere through their use of sound effects. This is especially effective when edited into scenes that, at first, appear somewhat mundane, then through sound editing, grow increasingly threatening to the audience. Theatre. Directing theatrical productions consists of challenges that are not typically explored when directing films. In Don Taylor's directing plays, readers are exposed to what tools theatre directors can make use of when they are given the responsibility to reimagine and showcase an original vision of a text. This is also explored in detail in the dissertation paper Being Authentic in Life and on Stage, a phenomenological investigation of the actor as character. This paper also states that theatre directors, as opposed to film directors, tend to encourage their cast to give as close to an authentic performance as possible instead of relying on glaring special effects. This authenticity is what allows audience members to engage with productions that feature horror and comedy, since this allows them to be captivated in the narrative and atmosphere. The power behind text-based theatre productions is that the text serves as a starting point for the director in his artistic choices to achieve authenticity. In contexts where the starting point is not the text but the visuals, the physical resources used by the theatre practitioner are specific to the reality of the stage, such as the stage lighting. When used effectively, these semiotics can tremendously heighten the spectator's experience, especially when they are used to establish an eerie tone for horror productions or a light atmosphere for comedies. 4. Narrative. The narrative is an essential element in a performance piece, as this is what the audience will most likely engage with throughout their production. It was argued in narrative conventions of truth in the Middle Ages that the narrative is established to showcase a level of authenticity to a particular subject matter to an audience. This is also supported through Wallace Martin's recent theories of narrative, which references how a narrative typically reflects personal experiences and how historic events have been recorded using narrative writing. Examples of these can be found in episode 7 of the Dead Meat podcast, where James A. Janice and Chelsea Rebecca discuss the real-life torture weapons that were used throughout history, which eventually inspired or drew similarities towards the traps featured in the Saw film franchise. Authenticity and honesty are also apparent in the horror narrative, as this typically reflects the personal gains or needs of the characters and explores how to attain them while overcoming a certain obstacle. Hence, in a well-made horror production, the narrative leads the spectator to believe and engage in what is happening. In the case of the victims in the Saw film franchise, according to the Wesleyan University blog Torture Porn and Confused Morality, Understanding Violence in the Saw franchise, these obstacles can be presented as another figure or as the restriction of having no other alternative other than having to commit unfavorable acts such as violence. These horror narrative tropes are further explored in Gender, Sexuality, and Queerness in American Horror Story critical essays by analyzing the writing, execution, and impact of the American Horror Story television series. An example of an almost inescapable obstacle that one of the characters from the series had to overcome was when Lana Winters was committed to the Briarcliff Manor in Season 2 Asylum. It was here in which, according to the critical essays, she was forced to endure electroshock therapy and bigotry for having lesbian desires. This book also unravels various ways in which the television series defies easily recognizable narratives that feature prominently in the horror genre, such as the presence of serial killers and their potential victim. In contrast, the narrative in comedy is most effective when it goes against the normal behavior and conventions and instead, through a disruptive manner, encounters an event with a tone and intensity unparalleled from reality. Film comedy further explores the elements that are prominent in the comedy narrative, including gags, slapstick, and gross-out comedy. These can also be incorporated in subgenres or other forms of narrative that are not comedy-based, including romance and horror. Horror comedy is especially a notable example of these subgenres, and it has now become a recognizable form of narrative. It also helps that it blends well with the horror slasher subgenre, as can be seen from films including An American Werewolf in London, The Cat and the Canary, and the Scream film franchise. 2.5. Style. To avoid misapprehension, it should be stated that style is not the same as genre. As mentioned in Rayleigh and Phillips's Introducing Theatre, the genre can be identified solely from the text, whereas style can be determined from the physicalized performance of the text. This difference is also explored in the book Horror Film Aesthetics, Creating the Visual Language of Fear, as well as other aspects of style such as visual effects, atmosphere, and performance styles. Further research, such as Bridget Cherry's book Horror, shows that one of the most prominent styles of horror incorporated in both film and theater was introduced through the Expressionist movement. Expressionism has elevated the concept of horror theater by encouraging the director to take advantage of the components presented in the script and to consider giving more importance to visuals. The styles associated with the movement also encouraged certain theater directors to transition to film production, and as a result, they became regarded as some of the most prominent figures in the German Expressionist movement during the 1920s. These figures went on to create some of the most iconic and influential works of horror, such as Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. These concepts are also explored in J.L. Stein's Modern Drama in Theory and Practice, Volume 3, Expressionism and Epic Theatre, which takes an analytical approach to the style and in what ways it is integrated into theatre productions. Stein exemplifies how elements of theater-based expressionism manifests horror by referencing the early 20th century German play Pandora's Box as an example, and specifies in what ways this production made drastic choices with its narrative and visual execution. One of these was done by visually reflecting Lulu's decline, such as by setting the play in a magnificent hall which then changed to a room in France, and finally a shabby attic room in London. The comedy genre also benefits through the style of the production, as is shown in Nicholas Krumgull's performance, style, and gesture in Western theatre. One such production is Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience, a comic opera that satirizes the aesthetic movement in 1870s and 1880s England. Because of how essential the visuals are to the narrative, the style is given a lot of importance and is primarily incorporated to develop the atmosphere of the opera and elevate the comedy. 2.6. Conclusion. Based on the research conducted and its evaluation, it was evident that all sources are relevant to this dissertation topic, and some of the examples given from these sources will also be incorporated into the practical aspect, especially those which directly reference the Saw franchise. There were still areas of this dissertation that, despite the relevance and importance of the literature, are inexistent. The researcher is able to create a list of influential horror films, but is unable to determine the relevance of these films, such as the Saw film franchise, amongst locals. There are sections in the upcoming chapters of this dissertation which will evaluate and explore these questions further, particularly in Chapter 3, Methodology, and Chapter 4, Findings.